My name is Orabelle May. I'm 38 years old. I've spent most of my adult life being described with words like steady, pleasant, and reliable. I live in a quiet suburb outside a large American city, in a house that always looked finished from the outside, trimmed hedges, clean windows, soft yellow lights glowing at dusk. For a long time, I believed that if something looks stable, it must be the woman who stayed calm and tense, the woman who stayed calm in tense rooms, the woman who smoothed over awkward moments with a polite smile. I wasn't loud. I wasn't confrontational. I didn't storm out of rooms or slam doors, so people assumed I didn't notice things. But I noticed everything. This story isn't about explosive betrayal. It isn't about scandal, or secret affairs, or dramatic screaming matches in the kitchen at midnight. There were no broken plates, no police reports, no viral courtroom moments. This story is about something quieter. It's about the slow erosion of self, the way you can lose yourself without anyone technically doing anything wrong, the way you can remain married for years, not because you are loved deeply, but because you are afraid to be seen as the one who failed. I stayed married because leaving felt like failing in front of everyone, and that fear of judgment kept me trapped longer than love ever did. What I'm going to share with you is not revenge. There's no villain in this story, at least not in the cinematic sense. There's only human weakness, social expectation, and the subtle ways we participate in our own silence. You'll hear about the small moments, the ones most people overlook. The first time I swallowed something, I should have spoken. The way respect can disappear, not with a bang, but with a shrug. And then, eventually, you'll see what shifted. Not in him, in me. This is a story about quiet dominance, about choosing stillness not as submission, but as a strategy, about reclaiming dignity without burning the world down to do it. I won't exaggerate. I won't dramatize. I'll tell it the way it happened, slow, ordinary, almost invisible, because sometimes the most life-changing decisions don't look dramatic at all. They look calm. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Gently, have you ever stayed somewhere longer than you should have? Not because you loved it, but because you were afraid of what people would think if you left. If you had asked my husband who I was during the first 10 years of our marriage, he would have smiled in that easy, public way and said, "She's the stable one." It always sounded like a compliment. Stable, reliable, grounded. The kind of woman who keeps the calendar organized and the pantry stocked. The kind who remembers which friend is allergic to almonds and which cousin is going through a divorce and needs a soft place to land during Thanksgiving. In our social circle, I was the calm center. When someone's marriage was in trouble, they called me. When someone's child was struggling in school, I recommended tutors. When someone forgot an anniversary, I quietly reminded them before it became a crisis. I was efficient, I was thoughtful, and I was invisible, not in a tragic way, not in a dramatic, poor me way. I wasn't ignored, I was appreciated. But appreciation is not the same as recognition. There's a subtle difference between being valued for who you are and being valued for what you provide. To my husband, I was competent. I was infrastructure. I was an emotional customer service. At dinner parties, he told stories, big gestures, ambitious plans, the promotion he was chasing, the new investment idea, the future lake house. I nodded. I filled in small details when necessary. I refilled glasses. I redirected awkward silences. I watched the room. People assumed I was quieter because I had less to say. The truth was I had more to observe. I noticed when his jokes about me shifted from affectionate to dismissive. "Oh, Orabelle doesn't care about that stuff," he'd say when the topic turned to finance or strategy. I have a degree in economics. I noticed when decisions started being phrased as updates instead of discussions. I told them we'd host. I said yes to that. I moved some money around. None of it sounded catastrophic. None of it was explosive enough to justify outrage. If I had complained, I would have looked dramatic. So I adjusted. I told myself marriage requires flexibility. I told myself this was a partnership. I told myself love doesn't need to be loud to be real. And to be fair, he wasn't cruel. He wasn't unfaithful. He didn't yell or belittle me in private. That's part of what made it so confusing. Nothing was wrong, and yet something was eroding. When people described me, they used words like supportive. When they described him, they used words like driven. Somehow, my ambition had dissolved into his biography. I remember one particular evening his work colleagues were over. One of them asked how we managed such a balanced life. He laughed lightly. She handles the home front so I can focus. Everyone smiled approvingly. I smiled too. But what he didn't mention was that I worked full-time, that I managed our investments, that I negotiated our mortgage rate. I built emergency savings quietly over the years because I believed in preparedness. He didn't lie. He just simplified me. And over time, I began to simplify myself. I spoke less about my ideas because it was easier. I let him take credit for shared decisions because it kept the peace. I absorbed small inaccuracies because correcting them felt exhausting. That's how invisibility works. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a series of small permissions you grant other people. Permission to underestimate you. Permission to narrate to you. Permission to define your role. And I participated in it. That's important. I wasn't a victim of cruelty. I was complicit in silence. But silence has a cost. When someone slowly becomes a supporting character in their own life, they don't notice at first. It feels like maturity. It feels like grace. It feels like choosing harmony, until one day you realize you are being described in rooms you're standing inside, and no one is looking at you when they say your name. That was who I was to them. The dependable wife, the calm one, the background. What I didn't understand yet was how expensive that role would become. I can tell you the exact moment something shifted, though, at the time. It didn't look like a shift. It looked like a sentence. We were at a small dinner gathering. 6 of us are around a narrow wooden table, candles burning low, wine glasses are half full, the kind of evening that photographs well. The conversation drifted toward career risks. Who had taken one? Who was considering one? I mentioned, lightly, that our nonprofit was preparing to expand into a new city. I had spent months researching the financial feasibility. It was delicate, strategic. I was proud of it. Before I could finish explaining, my husband placed his hand gently on my arm and said, smiling at the table, "She gets very passionate about her spreadsheets." Everyone laughed. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't sharp. It was delivered with warmth, a teasing tone, the kind of comment couples make all the time. But something inside me stilled, because what I had been sharing wasn't a hobby. It wasn't color-coded tabs for fun. It was a risk assessment, budget forecasting, strategic growth planning. And in one soft sentence, it became cute. The conversation moved on. I didn't correct him. That would have felt disproportionate, overreactive. So I laughed too. That was the first small cut. What makes moments like that so powerful is their deniability. If I had brought it up later and said it bothered me, he would have looked confused. I was just joking. You know, I'm proud of you. You're being sensitive. And maybe I would have believed him, because he wasn't trying to wound me, but intention doesn't erase impact. After that night, I began noticing a pattern not dramatic, not obvious, but consistent. When I spoke about work, he summarized it. When I explained something complex, he translated it into something simpler for others. When decisions were discussed publicly, he spoke as if he had initiated them even if they were mutual. He didn't erase me entirely. He just softened my edges. And what disturbed me most was that no one else noticed. Our friends still saw us as balanced, modern, respectful. We weren't the couple that fought. We weren't the couple with tension you could feel across the table. If anything, we were admired. That admiration became its own kind of prison. Because how do you explain a discomfort that leaves no visible bruise? I remember lying in bed a few nights later, staring at the ceiling, replaying the sentence. She gets very passionate about her spreadsheets. It sounded harmless, but beneath it was a quiet message. Your seriousness is excessive. Your expertise is adorable. Your contribution is secondary. And I realized something unsettling. I had been so committed to being easy to love that I had become easy to diminish. That thought didn't make me angry. It made me careful. From that point on, I started observing more closely. Not reacting, not confronting, just watching. I watched how often he interrupted me versus others. I watched how frequently I deferred automatically. I watched how people's eyes drifted back to him when I spoke. Patterns reveal themselves when you're no longer trying to defend against them. That dinner party didn't end our marriage. It didn't even cause an argument, but it planted awareness. And awareness is rarely loud. It's a quiet discomfort you can't unfeel once you've felt it. The first small cut is never fatal. It's just the moment you realize your skin has been thinner than you thought. After that dinner, nothing exploded. There were no confrontations, no tearful conversations across the kitchen island, no dramatic vows to do better. Life simply continued. And that's how normalization begins. It happens in repetition. A week later, we were at brunch with another couple. The conversation turned toward investing. One of them mentioned market volatility and laughed nervously about their retirement account. I started to explain a conservative rebalancing approach, something I had actually implemented in our own portfolio during a downturn years earlier. Before I could finish the sentence, he leaned back in his chair and said lightly, "Oh, she's the cautious one. I'm the risk taker." It was framed as a balance, a charming contrast. Everyone nodded. It made sense to them. It fit the narrative. He was ambitious. I was careful, except I was also the one who had identified a profitable opportunity 2 years prior. I was the one who tracked performance quarterly. I was the one who read economic reports over morning coffee while he skimmed headlines. But correcting him would have sounded competitive. So I let it pass. That's the part no one talks about, the internal negotiation. You tell yourself, it's not worth it. It's small. He didn't mean it that way. Don't make this bigger than it is. And because you love him, or at least because you love the idea of your shared stability, you choose harmony over precision. The comments weren't daily, they weren't even weekly, but they were consistent enough to create shape. At home, decisions started arriving pre-decided. I told Mark we'd invest in the property. I signed us up for that event. I committed to the trip in October. He always said but the decision had already been made. The first few times, I asked questions, calmly, logically. Did we talk about that? Can we review the numbers first? And he would respond with reassurance, sometimes mild irritation. Of course, we'll review it. I knew you'd agree. You trust me, right? That last one was subtle pressure. Trust became a performance metric. If I hesitated, I risked looking unsupportive. If I insisted, I risked looking controlling. And I had built my identity on being reasonable. So I adjusted. Again, I started pre-reviewing things quietly, running numbers in my planner, building contingencies in private. I told myself that as long as I was safeguarding our future, it didn't matter who received public credit. That's how I rationalized it. I convinced myself that visibility was ego, that correction was unnecessary, that my silence was maturity, but something else was happening beneath that logic. Each time I swallowed a correction, I trained him to assume I would. Each time I absorbed a simplification, I confirmed it. And each time someone laughed at a gentle dismissal, I smiled, teaching the room that it was acceptable. Disrespect rarely arrives wearing a villain's coat. It arrives dressed as humor, as efficiency, as that's just how we are. And because there was no shouting, no betrayal, no obvious cruelty, I struggled to justify my discomfort even to myself. I began to doubt my own calibration. Was I expecting too much? Was I misinterpreting tone? Was this just marriage, two people smoothing each other's rough edges in public? But here's what I couldn't ignore. I started speaking less, not because I had less to say, because I was tired of translating myself back into seriousness after being softened into something ornamental. And the more I withdrew, the more it confirmed the narrative. She's just quieter. She doesn't care about that stuff. Silence became evidence against me. That was the quiet tragedy of it. I was normalizing something I couldn't name yet. And in doing so, I was helping construct the role that would eventually confine me. There's a moment in every long relationship when you realize you are no longer being responded to, you are being anticipated. Not in a romantic way, in a structural way. By year 11 of our marriage, I could predict exactly how I would be introduced in any room. This is Orabelle, she keeps everything running. She's the organized one. She makes sure I don't forget my own head. It always sounded affectionate, but affection can still confine you. I began noticing that my identity had been reduced to function. I was the systems manager of our shared life, the quiet administrator behind his visible momentum. When people needed practical advice, they came to me. When they needed inspiration, they went to him. I had been assigned the role of reliability, and reliability is useful, it is respected, but it is rarely centered. At home, the dynamic deepened in small, almost invisible ways. If something went wrong, a missed payment, a scheduling conflict, a forgotten detail, it was somehow mine to fix, not because he demanded it, but because everyone, including me, assumed I would. When something went right, a successful investment, a smooth event, a financial milestone, he told the story. I handled the mechanics. He narrated the outcome. I don't think he consciously crafted this imbalance. I truly don't. Roles settle into place the way water settles into the lowest point, and I made myself low friction. The hardest realization wasn't that he underestimated me. It was that he no longer needed to consider me. There's a subtle difference between being loved and being factored in. He loved me. I believe that, in his way, in the way a man loves the structure that supports him solid, assumed, dependable. But when he imagined the future, I was part of the backdrop, a given, a constant. Constants don't get consulted. They get relied upon. I remember one evening vividly. We were reviewing potential vacation plans. He was animated, excited, sketching ideas out loud. I asked gently, "Have you thought about what I might want?" He paused, not defensively, just genuinely surprised. "I mean, you're pretty flexible." That sentence landed heavier than the dinner party joke months before. Flexible? It sounded like praise. It was actually erasure. Flexibility meant my preferences were negotiable, adjustable, secondary. It meant I could be bent without breaking, and therefore bending was expected. And here's what unsettled me most. I had been proud of that trait. I had built my identity on adaptability, on being the woman who didn't create friction, the woman who understood context, the woman who chose peace over ego. But peace without visibility is just quiet compliance. That was the role I had been assigned and gradually accepted. Reliable, useful, emotionally literate, strategically silent. I was the woman who would never embarrass him publicly, never challenge him in front of others, never make things uncomfortable, which meant in rooms full of people, I became smaller, not physically, not dramatically, energetically, and when you shrink yourself consistently, people stop measuring your full height. The most disorienting part was this from the outside. Our marriage looked stable, admirable, even enviable. We didn't fight, we didn't create scenes, we didn't threaten divorce during arguments. Because I had internalized something powerful, leaving would mean I failed, not just at love, but at being the composed, competent woman everyone believed I was. If I walked away, people would ask questions. What happened? Was it infidelity? Was it money? Was it something dramatic enough to justify dismantling something that looked so intact? And I had no cinematic answer, only erosion, only a slow disappearance inside a role that felt both flattering and suffocating. I didn't know it yet, but recognizing the role was the beginning of stepping out of it. Not loudly, not angrily, but deliberately. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen after a cruel remark or a dramatic revelation. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon while I was standing in our kitchen, rinsing a coffee mug. Rain pressed softly against the Seattle windows. The house was quiet. He was upstairs on a conference call, his voice rising and falling in confident waves. I remember looking at my reflection in the darkened glass, and for the first time, I didn't see a patient wife. I saw a woman waiting for permission. That realization didn't feel angry. It felt clarifying. Earlier that day, he had forwarded me an email. He'd committed us to co-signing on a business venture with a friend. The tone of the message wasn't malicious. It was efficient. I told him we're in. You're okay with that? Not a question, a conclusion. Normally, I would have opened my planner, reviewed the numbers, run projections quietly, and then told myself that partnership meant trust. But this time, I didn't open the spreadsheet. I just stood there. And I asked myself something I had never asked directly before. If nothing about this marriage changes, who will I be in 5 years? The answer came quickly. Quieter, smaller, more efficient, less visible. And the most unsettling part, no one would think anything was wrong. I realized I had been measuring the health of my marriage by the absence of chaos. No yelling meant stability. No betrayal meant loyalty. No public humiliation meant respect. But respect isn't just the absence of harm. It's the presence of acknowledgement. And I had been living on technicalities. That afternoon, I didn't confront him. I didn't send a sharp email back. I didn't initiate a dramatic conversation. Instead, I did something much more radical. I stopped compensating. When he came downstairs later and mentioned the business deal casually, waiting for my usual analytical reassurance, I didn't offer it. I simply said, "We'll need to review the structure before I agree." It was calm, neutral, controlled. He blinked slightly, surprised by the wording. "Agree?" he asked. "Yes," I said gently. "Agree. Not approve, not support. Agree." It was a small linguistic correction, but it shifted something fundamental. For the first time in years, I didn't cushion my position. I didn't soften it with humor or flexibility. I let the sentence stand. He didn't argue. He just nodded, slightly puzzled, and changed the subject. But inside me, something realigned. The shift wasn't about defiance. It was about ownership. I realized that my silence had never been weakness, but it had been unstructured, automatic, reflexive. If I were going to stay, it could no longer be passive. And if I were going to leave someday, it would not be impulsive. That was the day I stopped asking whether I was overreacting and started asking whether I was participating in my own diminishing. The rain kept falling. The kitchen remained quiet. Nothing broke. Nothing exploded. But I felt different, less compliant, more observant, calmer, not because I had decided to end my marriage, but because I had decided to see it clearly. And clarity, once it arrives, doesn't leave. After that Tuesday, I didn't become louder. I became deliberate. There's a difference. Before, my silence had been instinctive. It was the smooth reflex of someone trained to maintain equilibrium at all costs. I filled gaps. I softened the edges. I translated tension into humor before it fully formed. Now, my silence had weight. When he made assumptions, I didn't rush to validate them. When he narrated shared decisions as his own, I didn't immediately correct him, but I also didn't reinforce it with a smile. I let statements sit, and that made him slightly uncomfortable, not threatened, not angry, just unsettled. One evening, we were out with friends again, a familiar setting, familiar lighting, familiar roles. Someone asked about an investment property we'd acquired years earlier, the one I had researched, negotiated, and structured carefully. He began telling the story. Halfway through, he glanced at me, almost automatically, expecting me to fill in the numbers like I always did. I met his eyes and simply said, "You can explain the financing." It wasn't sharp. It wasn't sarcastic. It was factual. He hesitated, because he couldn't, not fully. The silence stretched just long enough for the table to notice, not awkwardly, but perceptibly. He recovered quickly, pivoted, and laughed it off. But something had shifted again. For the first time, my confidence was not invisibly backing him up, and he felt the absence of it. At home, I stopped pre-solving problems he hadn't even noticed yet. If a bill was due and he had said he would handle it, I let him handle it. If a scheduling conflict arose from his commitment, I didn't automatically rearrange my calendar to accommodate it. Not out of spite. Out of alignment, silence, when it is chosen, becomes informative. He began asking more questions, not because I demanded it, but because the safety net was no longer automatically there. "Have you looked at this? What do you think? Does this make sense?" His tone wasn't defensive. It was uncertain. And I realized something quietly powerful. He had mistaken my consistency for infinite capacity. When you perform stability flawlessly for long enough, people stop considering the cost of it. My silence now carried boundaries, invisible ones, but real, and others interpreted it differently. Some saw it as moodiness. Some saw it as distance. He sometimes saw it as stress. No one labeled it as strength. That was fine. Strength doesn't need an announcement. What fascinated me most was how quickly people adjust when you stop performing for them. At work, I was decisive, clear, direct. At home, I had been diplomatic to the point of dilution. Now, I allow the same clarity to exist in both spaces. If I disagreed, I said so calmly, without cushioning it in excessive reassurance. "I don't think that's financially sound. That doesn't work for me. I won't commit to that yet." Simple sentences, measured, controlled. He wasn't angry. He was recalibrating. And so was I. For years, I believed silence was something done to me. Something I endured. Something I swallowed. Now, it was strategic. I wasn't withdrawing love. I was withdrawing automatic compliance. There's a profound difference. And the most unexpected part, I felt calmer than I had in years. Not because the marriage had improved, but because I was no longer disappearing inside it. Silence, when intentional, isn't weakness, it's an observation. And observation is preparation. When people imagine preparation, they picture confrontation, raised voices, secret phone calls, legal folders hidden in drawers. That wasn't my style. My preparation looked like routine. I started waking up 30 minutes earlier. Not to cry, not to spiral, just to think clearly, without interruption. I reviewed our financial accounts with fresh eyes, not as a supportive spouse double-checking logistics, but as an independent adult assessing exposure. What was in the joint accounts? What was solely in his name? What was solely mine? What would liquidity look like if I needed it? For years, I had managed most of it anyway. That was the irony. I knew the architecture of our financial life intimately, but this time, I wasn't managing it for us. I was mapping it for myself. I updated passwords quietly, appropriately, legally. I ensured my professional certifications were current. I revisited contacts I hadn't spoken to in a while, not dramatically, just reconnecting. Preparation didn't feel like betrayal, it felt like clarity. At work, I accepted a leadership development opportunity I would have previously declined because it required travel. Before, I would have thought about how it inconvenienced him. Now, I ask myself one question: does this strengthen me? If the answer was yes, I proceeded. I also began documenting not in a secret dossier kind of way, but in my leather-bound planner. Dates, commitments made without discussion. Financial decisions are presented as conclusions, conversations where I had clearly stated boundaries, not to weaponize later, but to prevent gaslighting, especially self-gaslighting. Memory becomes unreliable when you've been minimizing your own experience for years. I wanted objective clarity. Something else shifted too. I stopped defending him when he wasn't in the room. Previously, if someone gently questioned my intensity or dominance in conversation, I would smooth it over. He's just passionate. He means well. That's just how he communicates. Now, I let comments land without translation. It wasn't disloyalty. It was neutrality. And neutrality changed the atmosphere subtly. He began noticing that I wasn't reflexively reinforcing the image of him. Not criticizing, not correcting, just not curating. There is power in not curating someone else's reputation. At home, I observed patterns I had previously ignored. When he succeeded, he expanded outward more confidence, more decisions, more declarations. When he felt uncertain, he leaned on me, but only privately. Publicly, he remained the narrator. I realized I had been both the foundation and the safety net. If I ever stepped away, he wouldn't collapse, but he would feel gravity. That realization didn't bring me satisfaction. It brought me responsibility, because I understood something deeply uncomfortable. If I chose to leave, I would destabilize more than just him. Friends would be confused. Families would ask questions. People would search for scandal and find none. And I would be the one who initiated change in a structure that looked solid, which meant I needed to be certain. Preparation became less about logistics and more about identity. Who am I without this marriage? What do I value when no one is watching? Am I staying because I believe in this partnership, or because I fear the optics of ending it? That second question lingered. Fear of judgment kept me trapped longer than love ever did. But the more prepared I became, the less trapped I felt. Not because I had decided to leave, but because I knew I could. And there is a profound psychological shift that happens when staying becomes a choice instead of a default. No one noticed these changes. Not our friends, not our families, not even him, at least not consciously. From the outside, I was still composed, still steady, still the woman who kept everything running. But beneath that surface, I was repositioning, not emotionally volatile, strategically aligned. And when you begin preparing quietly, something inside you hardens not into bitterness, but into resolve. I wasn't angry, I was awake. There's a moment in quiet preparation when information stops being abstract and becomes decisive. For me, it happened on an ordinary Saturday morning at my desk. He was out for a run. The house was still. I had my planner open beside my laptop, a cup of coffee cooling near my hand. I wasn't looking for ammunition. I was looking for clarity. I began reviewing a series of investment transfers he had initiated over the past 2 years. Not suspicious ones, just confident ones. Moves are made quickly, often introduced to me as updates rather than proposals. As I traced the flow of funds, I noticed something subtle. Several of the assets, though discussed publicly as ours, were structured primarily under his name, not maliciously, not secretly, but strategically for him. Tax advantages, liability shielding, risk concentration. And while I had ensured that many of our stable holdings were balanced, I realized something undeniable. If I walked away tomorrow, the public narrative would still be that we built everything together. But the legal structure told a slightly different story. I felt no panic, just stillness, because here was the truth. I had allowed the architecture of our marriage to tilt not dramatically, but incrementally. I had trusted that fairness would naturally distribute itself. It doesn't. Fairness must be intentionally structured. I opened a separate document and began mapping scenarios. If we separated amicably, what would division look like if we mediated? What leverage existed? If we litigated, which I didn't want, what evidence would matter? Again, this wasn't about revenge. It was about reality. For years, I had protected us from external instability, but I had not protected myself from internal imbalance. And that morning, I saw clearly that my silence had financial implications, not just emotional ones. The private reveal wasn't that he had betrayed me. It was that I had assumed partnership meant symmetry. It doesn't. Partnership requires active participation from both sides. And I had participated in maintenance, not negotiation. There was another layer, too. As I reviewed emails and agreements, I noticed something else. He relied on my competence more than he acknowledged. In several ventures, my analysis had prevented higher risk exposure. My conservative planning had insulated us from volatility he hadn't even recognized. Without my influence, his trajectory would have been far less stable. That was the quiet leverage, not secrets, not a scandal. Competence, consistency, documentation. I leaned back in my chair and let that settle. For the first time, I didn't feel like the background. I felt informed, and information creates calm. I understood now that if I chose to leave, I would not be scrambling. I would not be emotionally explosive. I would not be dependent on his narrative. I would be prepared. That clarity didn't make me eager to end the marriage. It made me honest about the cost of staying, because staying meant accepting a structure that benefited him more than me. Leaving meant dismantling something that looked stable, but was asymmetrical. There was no celebration in that realization, only gravity. I closed my laptop slowly. He returned from his run, cheeks flushed, energized, talking about pace and distance. I listened, and for the first time, I wasn't listening as the supportive wife evaluating logistics. I was listening as an independent woman assessing alignment. The private reveal wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, but it changed the equation permanently. Because once you understand your leverage, you stop negotiating from fear. And fear had been the only thing keeping me still. There wasn't a single cinematic moment where I packed a suitcase and stood in the doorway. The decision came the way most irreversible decisions do, after a long period of internal voting. For months, I lived in evaluation mode. Option 1, stay exactly as we were, maintain the image, maintain the rhythm, accept that invisibility was the price of stability. Option 2, confront aggressively, demand structural change, insist on rebalancing power, credit, and narrative. Option 3, leave calmly, strategically, without spectacle. Each option had consequences. If I stayed, I knew what my life would look like. Predictable, functional, respectable. I would continue to be the infrastructure of his ambition. I would grow quietly, but within the boundaries of his framing. If I confronted forcefully, I risked destabilizing the marriage in a way that felt reactive. And deep down, I knew something uncomfortable. You cannot negotiate someone into seeing you if they have grown accustomed to not needing to. Change demanded under pressure often reverts once the pressure fades, which left the third option, leaving, not because of betrayal, not because of abuse, not because of a scandal, but because I had outgrown a role I helped construct. That truth was difficult to accept. It would be easier if he had done something catastrophic, something easy to explain at dinner parties. Instead, the explanation was subtle. I stayed married because leaving felt like failing in front of everyone. That sentence haunted me. Failing at what? At commitment, at endurance. Being the calm, reasonable woman people admired. I realized I had been measuring success by duration, as if longevity alone validated health. One evening, I sat alone in our living room after he had gone to bed. The house was quiet, the same house that had once felt like proof of stability. I asked myself one final question. If no one else existed, no friends, no family, No social perception would I choose this life. The answer came faster than I expected. No, not because it was terrible, but because it wasn't equal. And equality, to me, had always mattered more than comfort. I felt grief in that realization. Not anger, not bitterness. Grief for the version of us that might have existed if I had spoken earlier. If I had demanded more precision when the first small cuts appeared. But regret is not a strategy. I knew something else too. If I stayed now, fully aware of the imbalance, I would eventually become resentful. And resentment erodes dignity faster than silence ever could. So the decision wasn't explosive. It was clean. I chose the irreversible option. I would leave. Not tomorrow, not impulsively, but deliberately. The difference between reaction and decision is preparation. And I had prepared. When I went upstairs that night, he was asleep, breathing evenly, unaware that the architecture of his life had just shifted. I looked at him not with hatred, not with triumph, with clarity. He hadn't intended to diminish me, but intention doesn't alter outcome, and I could no longer participate in a structure that required me to shrink. The decision felt heavy, but it also felt steady, like setting down something I had been carrying for years without realizing how tired my arms were. There was no adrenaline, only resolve. And once the resolve settles in, it doesn't waver easily. Once the decision was made, everything became procedural, not cold, not detached, just structured. I scheduled a consultation with a family law attorney under the pretense of updating estate documents. It wasn't deception, it was timing. I needed information before I initiated anything irreversible. The meeting was calm, professional, numbers on paper, options outlined without emotion, community property implications, asset division frameworks, mediation pathways. I didn't dramatize my marriage. I didn't paint him as dismissive or controlling. I simply asked precise questions. What does fairness look like in practice? What documentation matters? How do I protect myself without escalating conflict? Information replaces fear. After that meeting, I didn't rush home in tears. I stopped at a cafe, opened my planner, and began aligning steps. Separate bank account opened quietly. Funded gradually from income that was already mine. Credit report reviewed and printed. Professional network strengthened intentionally. Emergency fund repositioned into fully accessible liquidity. Everything I did was legal, transparent if ever questioned. I wasn't hiding money. I was stabilizing autonomy. At home, nothing changed outwardly. We still hosted dinners. We still discussed schedules. We still shared a bed. That was the strangest part. You can be emotionally finished while physically present, and no one notices. He continued narrating future plans. We should renovate next year. We could expand into another property. We'll probably travel more once things slow down. I listened, not correcting, not encouraging, just measuring alignment against the decision already made. I began decluttering my personal documents, scanning important files into encrypted storage, sorting sentimental items, not dramatically packing but organizing. Preparation looks like tidiness when no one is looking closely. There were moments when I questioned myself. Was I being too rigid? Was this solvable with one long, honest conversation? But then, I would replay years of minimized expertise, years of pre-decided conclusions, years of being factored in after the fact. This wasn't about one apology. It was about structural imbalance, and structures rarely change because of one emotional exchange. I also adjusted my schedule strategically. I accepted a larger leadership role at work, one that increased my visibility and compensation. Previously, I might have consulted him extensively. This time, I informed him. I've accepted the position. He looked surprised but proud. That's great, he said. We'll figure out how to balance it. The word felt different now, because I was no longer orienting my growth around his comfort. I wasn't punishing him. I was repositioning myself. The quietest part of this process was emotional. I stopped seeking validation from him. If something good happened at work, I celebrated internally first. If something difficult happened, I processed it independently before sharing. Detachment doesn't always look like distance. Sometimes it looks like reduced dependency. Weeks passed, then months, nothing outwardly fractured, which made what I was doing even more powerful. Because when the moment of disclosure arrived, it wouldn't be reactive. It would be informed. He believed we were stable, and in a way, we were. But stability without mutual recognition is just symmetry on the surface. Underneath, the foundation had already shifted, and I was almost ready to say it aloud. The first consequence wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a confrontation or a discovery. It was an absence. I stopped anticipating his needs. That sounds small. It isn't. For years, I had managed emotional weather patterns before they formed. If he had a stressful week ahead, I adjusted the house accordingly, lighter schedules, fewer social obligations, practical efficiencies he didn't even know he relied on. Now, I let the week unfold naturally. If he overcommitted, he felt it. If he forgot something, he corrected it. If tension lingered in a room, I didn't dissolve it instantly. The air changed. Not heavy, just unbuffered. He began to notice subtle friction. Did something happen, he asked one night, genuinely confused. No, I said calmly. Why? You seem different. Different? I wasn't colder. I wasn't hostile. I was simply no longer compensating. And when someone grows accustomed to being cushioned, the removal of that cushion feels like a loss, even if nothing aggressive has occurred. He started double-checking plans with me more often. Not always, but enough to signal awareness. Are we okay with this? Does that work for you? The questions were new, but they arrived late, because by then, my internal alignment had shifted from improvement to exit. Another consequence appeared socially. At a gathering, someone complimented him on his ability to manage everything so confidently. He laughed and glanced at me for reinforcement. I smiled but didn't add the usual supportive commentary about teamwork. The moment passed, but I saw it register. He was used to my amplifying his narrative. Without that amplification, his stories felt thinner, not untrue, just less supported. At home, he began offering help more proactively, loading the dishwasher without prompting, asking about my work in more detail, initiating conversations about balance. On the surface, it looked like an improvement, but I recognized something subtle. He was responding to discomfort, not to understanding. There's a difference between adjusting behavior and shifting perception. He sensed distance. He didn't yet grasp its origin. One evening, he said, almost casually, I feel like you've been pulling away. I considered denying it, but honesty had become non-negotiable for me. I've been recalibrating, I replied. He frowned slightly. From what? That question told me everything. He still didn't see the structure, only the symptoms. The consequences were beginning not as chaos, but as awareness. He felt less secure, less automatically affirmed. Our routines, once seamless, now required effort, and the effort revealed an imbalance. I didn't feel satisfaction watching him adjust. I felt inevitability, because once one person stops shrinking, the relationship must expand or fracture. And I had already decided which outcome I was prepared to accept. He started trying to fix something he couldn't yet name, planning small gestures, suggesting trips, asking for feedback more openly. If this had happened 2 years earlier, it might have changed everything. But timing matters. When clarity arrives too late, repair feels reactive. The consequences weren't explosive. They were atmospheric. He could feel the pressure shift, but he didn't know the storm had already passed. The moment he realized it was serious didn't happen during a fight. It happened during a quiet Sunday afternoon. We were sitting at the dining table reviewing upcoming travel plans. He had printed itineraries, highlighted restaurants, and mapped out experiences. He was animated and vested. I thought this would be good for us, he said. Time away, reset. Reset. The word lingered. I looked at him, really looked at him, at the man I had built a decade with. The man who was not cruel, not malicious, just accustomed. I'm not sure we're trying to fix the same thing, I said calmly. He stilled. What does that mean? It wasn't anger in his voice. It was confusion. That was when I told him not everything at once. Not dramatically, but clearly. I've been feeling structurally invisible for a long time. He blinked. Invisible, I don't understand. We're partners. I know that's what you believe, I said gently. But belief and experience aren't always aligned. I described patterns, not accusations, decisions made without consultation, public narratives that minimized my expertise. The role I had slowly absorbed. He listened. At first, defensively subtle interruptions, clarifications. I didn't mean it that way. That wasn't intentional. You never said it bothered you. And he was right. I hadn't, because fear of judgment kept me trapped longer than love ever did. I had been afraid that voicing dissatisfaction would make me look ungrateful, dramatic, difficult. So I stayed quiet until quiet became clarity. As I spoke, I watched something shift in his face. Not anger, recognition, and then something heavier, regret. I would have changed. he said quietly. If I had known. That sentence was the most painful of all, because maybe he would have. But knowledge delivered at the edge of departure feels different than knowledge offered during growth. I didn't doubt his sincerity. I doubted the sustainability. Change born from fear of loss often fades once stability returns. I don't want reactive change, I told him. I want mutual awareness, and I don't know if we ever built that. The room felt smaller. He stood up, paced once, and sat back down. So what are you saying? He asked, voice steadier now but tight. I'm saying I've already made a decision. Silence. Not explosive, not theatrical, just final. He searched my face as if looking for hesitation. There wasn't any. Panic doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like urgency. We can go to counseling. I can do better. We can restructure everything. We? The word felt heavier this time, because now it came from fear. I believed he meant it, but I also knew something quietly devastating. I had crossed the internal line months ago. You can repair misunderstandings. It is much harder to repair a prolonged erosion of identity. Too late doesn't mean too bad. It means the realization arrived after the decision. And once I reached that point, reversal wasn't compassion. It was self-betrayal. When I formally told him I was filing for separation, there was no raised voice. We sat across from each other at the same dining table where we had once planned vacations and investments. The late afternoon light came in softly through the windows. It could have been any ordinary day. I've spoken with an attorney, I said. I didn't rush the sentence. I didn't decorate it with an apology. He absorbed it slowly. You've already started the process. Yes. There it was, that word again. Yes. Not aggressive, not defensive, just factual. For a moment, I saw something flicker across his face that I hadn't seen before. Not dominance, not certainty, vulnerability. You didn't give me a chance, he said quietly, and that would have once undone me. Years ago, I would have immediately moved to soothe that discomfort, to reassure him, to absorb responsibility. This time, I stayed steady. I gave us years. I replied, I just didn't give you an ultimatum. The distinction mattered. An ultimatum is loud, emotional, urgent. What I had offered over the years was accommodation, adjustment, silence. He leaned back in his chair, hands clasped, as if trying to physically hold something together. I didn't realize you felt this diminished. That's part of the problem. I said, not accusing, just clarifying. We spoke for hours, but it never escalated. He asked for specifics. I gave them calmly. He expressed regret. I acknowledged it. He questioned the timing. I explained it. There was no dramatic catalog of grievances, just patterns. Patterns are harder to argue with than single events. At one point, he said, I never thought you'd leave. I believed him, because I had been the stable one, the flexible one, the one who valued commitment above all else. Leaving did not fit my public identity, which is exactly why I stayed longer than I should have. I didn't think I would either. I said honestly, that was the closest I came to visible emotion. Not tears, just gravity. We discussed logistics, housing, timelines, mediation. It sounded almost like a business meeting. And in some ways, we were dissolving a shared structure. But beneath the practicality, there was something else. Respect, not the surface-level admiration we had shown in public, but a quiet acknowledgement that this conversation was real. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't blaming, he wasn't threatening. He was trying to understand how something that looked intact could end without an explosion. And I was trying to explain that erosion rarely announces itself. Before we stood up from the table, he asked one final question. Is there anything I can say that would change your mind? I held his gaze. No, not cruel, not triumphant, just complete. That was the confrontation. No heat, no spectacle, no humiliation. Just two adults sitting in the truth. And the truth was this. I was no longer willing to be a supporting character in my own life. It has been 2 years since I left. If you saw me from a distance, you might not notice a dramatic difference. I still wake early. I still carry my leather-bound planner. I still prefer quiet rooms to loud ones. But internally, everything has shifted. I no longer measure stability by how little noise exists around me. I measure it by alignment. In the beginning, people asked careful questions. Was it mutual? Did something happen? You two always seemed so solid, I answered honestly. But simply, we grew in different directions. Most people nodded, satisfied with the absence of scandal. What I didn't say out loud was this. I finally grew in mine. Living alone at 38 was not frightening the way I once imagined. It was clarifying. I made decisions without pre-consulting someone's ego. I arranged my home based on my own rhythm. I pursued professional opportunities without calculating how they would balance against someone else's narrative. And something unexpected happened. My voice deepened, not literally, but in tone, in certainty. At work, I stepped fully into leadership. I no longer softened my expertise with self-deprecating humor when I presented the strategy. I didn't frame it as a suggestion, I framed it as insight, and people responded accordingly. Respect follows clarity. In friendships, I noticed something else. Conversations became more reciprocal. I wasn't managing emotional temperature anymore. I was participating. There's a profound difference between being the steady one and being the whole one. Do I regret my marriage? No, it taught me patience. It taught me financial discipline. It taught me how easily roles calcify when left unquestioned. But most importantly, it taught me that dignity is quiet. Leaving wasn't a rebellion. It was a realignment. He and I are civil, respectful, occasionally communicative about logistics still unfolding. There is no bitterness between us. Just acknowledgement, he once told me, months after the separation. I didn't realize how much you were holding. I smiled when he said it, not because it validated me, but because I no longer needed it to. That's the difference. When you leave for the right reasons, not anger, not spectacle, you don't carry resentment. You carry authorship. Today, I introduce myself differently, not as someone's wife, not as the stable one behind the scenes, but as Orabelle, a woman who values partnership but never at the expense of visibility, a woman who understands that love without mutual recognition becomes maintenance. And I no longer live in maintenance mode. I live in authorship. And that feels steady in a way silence never did. When I look back now, I don't see a villain. I see two people who slipped into roles without questioning them. I see a woman who confused endurance with strength. I see a marriage that looked stable because I absorbed the instability quietly. For years, I believed leaving would mean I failed. Failed at commitment, failed at resilience, failed at being the calm, capable woman everyone thought I was. But here is what I understand now. Staying is not always a strength. Silence is not always grace. And longevity is not proof of alignment. I stayed married because leaving felt like failing in front of everyone. But fear of judgment kept me trapped longer than love ever did. That's the part no one applauds. The invisible prison of perception. The way we curate our lives for an audience that isn't living inside our reality. The truth is, no one else wakes up in your mind. No one else negotiates your diminishing. No one else carries the cost of your silence. If something in your life looks perfect from the outside but feels imbalanced within, pay attention to that feeling. It doesn't require drama to be valid. It doesn't require betrayal to justify change. Sometimes the bravest decision is not explosive. It is calm, measured, irreversible. And it is yours. If you've ever stayed somewhere longer than you should have because you were afraid of what people would think, I want you to know this. You are not weak. You are human. But at some point, you have to decide whether you're protecting your image or protecting your identity. Tell me in the comments, have you ever confused endurance with strength?